All right, by my clock, it says it's 3:01-ish, almost 3:02. I wanted to give everybody a minute to get on, but we're going to go ahead and get started. We may have some others join us as well. I know that either this week or last week was the first day of classes for several folks, and they're still trying to juggle schedules. But we're so glad to have those of us who are on the call today. This is the first webinar for the new 2021-2022 academic year for the Society of Agricultural Communication Scholars. And so this organization, loose organization, was formed a couple of years ago to provide professional development for those of us who teach, do research and extension and outreach in the area of agricultural communications. And today we are going to be have a treat. We have two presenters today, Becky Haddad and Haley Trainey, are going to talk to us about building better boundaries. I want to thank Courtney Myers for recommending the two of them to talk about a lot of the things that we're dealing with about needing to have boundaries and some of the things that we're all dealing with, especially in light of this past year and a half in academia and how work has shifted and all of that. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Haley and Becky, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us. There's no pressure like being the first in the series. So thanks for the opportunity to join me today. We're excited to chat about building better boundaries. We'll talk today about dismantling targets, growing relationships, and really owning your yes. And so before we get started today, we do want to take a quick minute to introduce ourselves. I'm Becky Haddad, and my colleague Haley Trainey is here with us today. Haley's out at Oregon State, and I'm at the University of Minnesota. We are both wives, moms, and teachers, and that really informs a lot of our work in terms of the things that we need to think about when it comes to boundaries. And even if that is not a piece of your identity, this is still a relevant conversation for you. We will not be while we started this, because we were momming real hard, this is not the mom presentation. So when we think about boundaries, really kind of where we want to approach the conversation today is knowing that boundary work is ongoing identity work, and it's work. One of the things when we talk to ag teachers about this, boundaries are not this magical, like, hey, you have boundaries, your life is going to be so much better. All of a sudden, if you slap boundaries on work-life balance, you are going to be set. That's not the conversation today. We're going to kind of talk about some of the work that it might entail to reclaim or own your boundaries if you're not feeling like they are particularly strong. But we do want to offer the caveat before we get going today that this is work, and it's hard accountability work. We also want to offer that we are not experts in this. Sorry. If you know any experts in this, we would really love to meet them. But we come to this probably from hopefully from a pretty similar place as far as this is something that we are continuing to work on. This is daily work for us as well. And daily accountability work even between us as a presenting team. And so while our situations may look really different, we're new faculty, we're wives, we're moms of young kids, there's somewhere for everybody to join this conversation. So we'll turn it over to Haley to kind of situate us in what that conversation is going to look like today.
Thanks, Becky. Hi, all. It's great to be here today. Excited to talk about a topic that I feel really passionate about and also really struggle with. So throughout the conversation today, Becky and I will share some personal examples. We'll get pretty vulnerable with you at times, even though most of you are strangers to us, but that's okay. We're open books and just kind of share how we're coming at this and what we've done and what's worked and what we've seen has worked for others. So we'll kind of start this talk really situating ourselves and thinking about how we're entering this conversation kind of in the pandemic, post-pandemic. I don't even know where we're at anymore. Most of us are transitioning back to campus if you haven't already. And so what that looks like and how are we how are we different as a result of this pandemic, and how might that inform how we go about our work? So we'll talk about boundaries in academia and relationships and how we can start claiming those or reclaiming those, and then thinking about strategies and next steps. There's also a handout that we can put a link to in the chat as well. It was also part of that email that went out this morning. And that's just really going to walk us through the whole workshop and give you some tools for next steps. So a lot of the conversation around boundaries is focused on personal agency. And so I thought it was important to kind of acknowledge this tension between, agency and structure and systems. A lot of what we're going to talk about are things that we can specifically do personally to kind of take back our lives or to author our lives in a way that makes sense for us. But at the same time, it's kind of important to figure out, okay, how is this all situated? And all of our institutions and states might look a little different, but we're seeing more studies come out about how faculty are coming out of the pandemic or how they're interacting with the pandemic in terms of mental health and stress and anxiety and grief and even hopelessness. We also know that a lot of us have had to take on the emotional labor of guiding students through the pandemic and how that's kind of influenced our lives and our work. Certainly growing concerns about our students and what our role as faculty are to guide the student mental health piece. And there's also growing conversations about, hustle culture in academia. And are we pushing against that? Or how do we interact with this drive to publish or perish, to say yes to a bunch of opportunities, to chase opportunities, and how we're thinking about that. I'm seeing more and more conversations come out about a 4-day work week and thinking about how we can overall, the way that we work post-pandemic. And so this is an interesting topic to talk about when so many things in our system, in our world, are unsettled. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that. But at the same time, Becky and I come from this conversation at a point where even though we can create we can create boundaries in our lives, those aren't always just for us. A lot of times those boundaries are going to have significant impacts on our relationships, our departments, our institutions. And so although personal agency is important, we believe that we are actors in a system and we can have influence over that system. So we're going to turn it over to Becky for just some quick reflections to really think about how we're entering this conversation today.
Thanks, Haley. So we've situated ourselves for you a little bit, but we want to give you some time to kind of situate yourself as you come into this conversation as well, acknowledging that a lot has happened in the last year and a half. So if you're on the discussion guide, that's great. You're welcome to make a copy of that, and it's in the chat. So you can make a copy and take that on your own personal drive. It should be view-only right now. So to edit, you'll have to make a copy to your Google Drive. Otherwise, if you want to just take a minute to think about some of these things, that is completely fine as well. We want to start off just thinking about how are you entering this conversation? And so you're welcome to drop answers in the chat. We'll start off with first, what have I learned about myself? So over the last year and a half, what are some things that you have learned about yourself? So as answers roll in, some of the things we're starting to see in the chat. I'm a fixer. I'm not as organized as I thought I was. I want to fix things and help everywhere. What else have we learned about ourselves in the last year and a half? I need professional interactions to keep my motivation and energy high. I saw a bunch of nods on that one, Tracy. I need a break from being in my house and find some comfort from being in the office. I like shorter projects, so 2 months. I'm not superwoman. Thanks, Lori. I need to be around my colleagues and students to stay motivated. I can teach differently than I have over the past 2 decades, and it actually went okay. I like collaborating with peers and attending conferences to stay motivated. I'm not a K-12 teacher, and I know what empathy fatigue feels like. We're all human. Awesome. Thanks for sharing those, and continue to let those roll in. I learned just how much I can get done in 4 hours and what is actually possible in 4 hours of time. As you're seeing some of those other ones roll in, I want to be Wonder Woman, but I have to admit that I have to let something fall to the back burner occasionally and pick them up later when I'm more balanced. I like brainstorming in big groups, and I really missed that. I can work more independently than I thought. I'm more of an introvert than I thought. I really like TikTok, but also I need dedicated blocks of time to work where that distraction isn't likely. So thinking about some of those things and how you're coming to this conversation, what you've learned about yourself, I'd like you to shift a little bit to think, what am I not willing to sacrifice? So what am I not willing to sacrifice? What are those things that I'm going to hold sacred? Family time with wife and kids. Health, mine and my family members. Family time, solitude, personal time to recharge. That face-to-face interaction with students, even if it is on Zoom. Personal time and outdoor recreation. A decent night's sleep. Yes. Family, friends, time outdoors. Health, physical and mental. You get seconds on that decent night's sleep. Awesome. So as we're thinking about those, operationalizing that a little bit more, what does it actually look like then for that to come into your work? So thinking about what I've learned about myself, what I'm not willing to sacrifice, how might that actually show up? How do you want to see that then in your work? Flexible work schedule and location, less email, deeper thinking, meeting those boundaries, kind of those recognizing how those lines got blurred when we didn't have the physical separation between work and home. I think that was finally when I like ugly cried during in March or April last year, was just that like, I just need some space. Flexibility, that day doesn't have to just exist between 8 and 5. Being open with students about taking care of yourself and being that role model in the classroom. So what do you want your students to take from you in your own work habits? Structured time during the day so that you don't have to sacrifice your evenings. Trying to stop following, the carrot on the stick and start enjoying work for what you get out of it, not the goal set by others. Blocking time for really deep work and stating those expectations. You can feel free to keep those coming in. That workday needs a hard stop. Having to leave the house for that deep work, zooming into service meetings rather than staying on campus late. And those are all really great examples. These are all things we'll ask you to probably bring back a little bit as we move through the conversation as well. Even some of those mindset things that just emails can wait till I get to the office in the morning. They don't need to be answered as soon as my phone pings. So awesome. Thanks for sharing those. Feel free to continue sharing those and keep those side conversations up in the chat. We are going to switch gears a little bit. So we've started kind of hitting at some of these targets. One of the things we want to back out of a little bit is we think about, how do I want to see this in my work? We also have to acknowledge, if this is going to come into our work, what targets are we aiming at? And so when we think about some of these targets, thinking about first, what targets do I use to measure myself at work? What are my choices grounded in? Who's affected by my targets? And so we'll share in the chat. Again, I'll drop the question there. What targets do you use to measure yourself at work? And while those are rolling in the chat, I'll let Haley share an example of potentially of some ways to think about the target conversation.
I'll share too. I told you we were getting candid here. I don't know if anyone knows Erin McKim at Michigan State, but I had to think about this one. And as soon as Becky brought this question, I was like, oh my gosh, Erin McKim. So backstory, Erin was a grad student at Oregon State. I took over his office space. I actually took over his apartment. So I was like trying to take over all this really great work that he'd done at Oregon State as a grad student. And I find myself comparing myself to him quite a bit. He's a phenomenal guy, teacher and scholar, and I aspire to be like him. But I have to remember that, he's in a different position than I am. He's a different person. He has different skills and characteristics, and I have to kind of check myself because I didn't really know that was a target until I really thought about this question. And so that has kind of made me start to chase certain opportunities that maybe I wouldn't otherwise. The second one is, I'm starting my third year as an assistant professor. So that P&T target is on the horizon. And it's the age-old problem. I don't know what I'm going after. There's no metrics, there's no markers. And so this target is very blurry. And I have found myself saying yes to all these things, but it's not because I particularly want to do them, and maybe I don't feel passionate about them, but I just feel like I need them. But it's definitely had an effect on my work, on my mental health, on my family, my grad students. They get less of me, they get less support because I'm starting to spread myself too thin. And so those are kind of two big targets that I've had to check quite a bit because I noticed the effects that they were having.
So as you're willing to share your own thinking about what targets you use to measure yourself at work, this might also be a good opportunity to kind of think about some of those unwritten metrics as far as what are those things that I measure myself against that may or may not be written down somewhere, or may not actually be that are perceived or real expectations, and kind of thinking about some of where some of those different things come from. The one in the chat, ability to delegate and not micromanage others' processes as a target. Awesome. Thank you, Tracy. Making sure graduate students graduate on time. What's on time? Exactly. Thanks for sharing that one, Courtney. And as you're thinking about some of those, this one takes a little bit longer. We're not going to have all the time we would love to have to let you just sit and marinate on this question. But as you're thinking about that, also thinking about kind of what are those choices grounded in. So when we think about some of the choices we're making as far as what I'm not willing to sacrifice and how these things maybe show up in my work relative to the targets I feel like I need to hit, where do my priorities lie? What are those choices that I need to make that kind of say, this is something I'm going to commit to or not? So taking a minute to really think about, where do I ground my choices? Kind of what's my anchor when I'm going back to, is this something I should say yes to or not? When I think about where and how I'm going to spend my time, what's that thing that kind of anchors you? Jamie shared, I often find the weight of the whole college's targets and goals are burdened by each faculty member, so it's hard for me to separate what I'm able to achieve from what we're told we need to achieve as a collective. That's an awesome insight. Thanks for sharing that, Jamie. And I know that's maybe been something that we found magnified, at least in my household. I know that's been magnified with the pandemic. When we're working in isolation, we feel those targets, maybe we feel more responsibility individually to those targets, and we don't get to hear how other people are doing those, and we don't have that collaboration at lunchtime and passing in the hallway and in between meetings and classes. Courtney said we're going through an exercise recently to clarify faculty appointments in terms of that research, teaching, and service, just being able to recognize what we're already doing. And so not having to necessarily add anything to be meeting that research, teaching, and service, but also how each person has that unique role, and just getting to see what everybody else is doing can be hugely helpful. So as you continue to think about what those choices are grounded in, also think about who is affected by those choices. I know we said there were a ton of, I'm not willing to sacrifice family. So that may seem like the obvious one as far as who's affected by my choice to stay on campus until 8 p.m., 10 p.m., 1 in the morning, whatever. But also thinking about, Haley shared the example a little bit earlier, you know, my grad students don't get what they need from me when I'm stretched in all these other areas from saying yes to kind of chase P&T. So thinking about who's affected by those choices when we're working to aim for these particular targets. Kelsey shared we have to log everything into an online system, so digital measures. Some of you are probably also familiar with that. If you want it to count for your annual review and toward your role statement. So if it's not in the system, it doesn't exist in terms of how the department head and dean see it. And so those metrics help keep you focused. That's a great example, Kelsey. Thanks. So as you continue to marinate on those questions, like I said, we could probably spend a whole workshop just thinking about these questions. But thinking here as we kind of move forward, just where you've come over the last year and a half, where you are and where you'd like to be. Because one of the ways to really cultivate, reclaim your boundaries, really kind of self-author that life and career you want is to kind of really think about where have I been, where am I now, where am I headed, to really kind of take control and reclaim those boundaries.
What the heck are boundaries anyways? We've been talking about them already, and y'all already have many boundaries, and you've identified things you want to protect. So we're really just thinking about boundaries as limits. Limits defining you in a relationship to someone or people or a group of people or your department or something. Maybe it's your position description. So thinking about what are those limits? Where does your job start and where does it end? Where does it stop? What are you responsible for? What are you expected to do? What are you not responsible for? What are you not expected to do? What do you want to protect? What do you want to keep doing in your job, in your life? And how can you make choices around that? You know, thinking about boundaries, it's really about choices. What are some things that you can set up in your life? What are some practices that you can start or habits? What are some perspectives that maybe you want to hold to? What are some mindsets that you want to keep in mind as you go about making choices? You know, thinking about your work, your life is really a series of choices. And boundaries allow you to make the choices that you want to make and be happy with those. And not feel like you have to make choices to say yes to things that you don't want to say yes to. We like to talk about boundaries as freedom. So freedom from certain things, but also freedom for things. Freedom to do the things that you ought to do because you want to do them, because it makes you happy, because it's important to you, but also freedom to do the things that's expected of you with your position. And so kind of navigating all those opportunities to make choices in a way that makes sense for you. We think of boundaries as porous. not rigid walls. So we can have these rules, we can have these practices, but it's not always going to be so black and white. And so thinking about flexible boundaries in a way, and maybe circumstances where you are willing to be more flexible with your boundaries. There's generally 5 main types of boundaries, and we can probably quickly identify maybe the one that we need to work on the most, or thinking about academia in general. So emotional boundaries, maybe things around personal topics or inappropriate topics, emotional dumping, emotional labor, or dismissing emotions altogether. Boundaries around time and energy, lateness with students perhaps, when you can contact people, when they can contact you, favors, free labor, workload, and those expectations that go with it. Material boundaries, so thinking about possessions, office space, when they can be used, how they should be treated. Physical boundaries, so kind of thinking about your bodies, proximity, unwanted comments, things like that. And then mental boundaries, freedom to have your own thoughts, beliefs, opinions, and values. These boundaries show up in all aspects of our lives, but certainly we can think about these boundaries within our roles on campus, our roles with students, with each other, with our unit heads, with our college, things like that. So here's some examples. I'll share mine and then I'll ask Becky to share some of hers. These are things that I am thinking about for this academic year. I'm in year 3, I've got a lot going on, and I need to really start making some tough decisions. So one thing that I'm going to work on is no new service activities. Stay committed to things I'm already committed to, and try not to take in any more. So I said try because it's going to be hard. I will fall. No new major projects. I have this ongoing boundary where I try to keep Thursdays just for research so I can really engage in the deep work. No taking on projects or commitments that require evenings. I've got a toddler, and so I have to pick her up by 4, and that's going to be really important to me, that evening time with her. We have a kind of a standing boundary in our department. If the office door is closed, that means you're unavailable and you can't just kind of interrupt. This year, I'm focusing on maintenance rather than growth. So maintaining the projects that I have, the initiatives that I have, the programs that I direct, and try not to think about building and growing at this point. I'm in a maintenance phase. And I'll talk about this example later, but trying to get some more buffers between meetings, even if it's 5 minutes. That's something that's important to me. And I don't want to do 4 hours of back-to-back Zoom meetings anymore, if I can help it. Becky?
As I looked back down my list, I realized all of mine kind of stem from this first one, or are ways to kind of enforce this first one of if you're going to be present, be present. If you can't be, don't be. And so on one side with my family, not bringing that work piece that I don't have work email notifications that pop up on my phone. If I am expecting something urgent, I might look, but it can probably, and a couple of people had noted this in the chat as well, it can probably wait until I get to work the next morning. So being present both with my family and being fully present at work when I'm at work. Having those scheduled unavailable times, which is probably a boundary more for me than it is for enforcing things with anybody around me. It's giving myself the room to get to work and not just dive right into the first project, to give myself room to read a chapter of our book for class, or to check and respond to emails and get some of those things, just get my day going, and having some of those things just scheduled out and blocked time for. We'll talk about the tomorrow test a little bit more in strategies. I've probably taken this to the extreme, but as I process some of those emails, really looking at those requests and could I do this tomorrow? And do I actually have that block of time tomorrow that I could do it? Because I'm not going to have hours beyond the 24 hours in a day next week. I don't want to work all of those 24 hours in a single day. I'm not going to get more than 7 days next week. I'm not going to get more weeks in a month. I'm not going to get more months in a year. So looking at that and really looking at, could I do it tomorrow? And if I can't do it tomorrow, then I really either need to think about what comes off my plate so I can, or is this something that I just don't do? I've also started closing my email when I'm working on time sensitive tasks so that they don't take me longer than they need to, because I'll get distracted seeing that little yellow icon show up to let me know that there's a new email. And then also, if I take on a new project, actually blocking time for it then on my calendar. And so those are a few as far as just some boundaries that especially around my time.
So there's some other folks in the room who have willingly shared some of their boundary stories. I'm going to reshare so I can share my sound. So we have a couple of video interludes to share throughout this presentation. And the first is from someone in the room, Dr. Lori Baker. I'm going to press play. Hopefully you all can hear her story.
Hi, I am Laurie Baker, an associate professor at the University of Florida, and I'm going to answer the question related to boundaries because at the beginning of COVID-19, I didn't do a very good job of setting boundaries for my work life, for my home life. We had been back at the University of Florida for maybe about half a year when the lockdown happened, and so it was really easy, since I didn't have a rhythm yet, to work into the wee hours of the night, to be working extra early. And there was a point in the pandemic where I realized this was adversely affecting my health, both mentally as well as physically. I wasn't taking care of myself, and it was starting to show in my annual checkup and some other things that were happening. And so I did transition to being more thoughtful about boundaries, and a part of that for me was also exploration of my faith. And I purchased a book related to setting boundaries. It's called Boundaries for Thriving, Living a Full Life by Setting Godly Boundaries. And one of the things that I think I had trouble with initially setting boundaries is I always felt like if I told people no, that was me being mean or unchristian-like. Where I felt like I just always had to give 100% of my time to anybody who wanted it or anyone who asked for it. But one thing I realized through reading this book and visiting with others is that people often respect you when you set boundaries and when you stick to those boundaries. So I'm trying to do better at that. It's a work in progress, and it is constantly reminding myself that I am allowed to say no. And there are times when an opportunity might have to pass me by, and that's okay. Or somebody might have to rely on somebody other than me to help them with a project, or to edit their work at that moment in time if they need it that very minute and I just can't fit it in. So setting those boundaries both at home and at work has been a huge challenge for me, but I think COVID-19 has pushed me to do that. And I think long term, I'm going to be a better employee. I'm going to be a better mother. I'm going to be a better wife because of setting some of these boundaries. So I'm thankful for that piece of COVID, that perhaps I may not have learned this lesson till much later in my career than I am right now. So I hope that helps somebody else learn about setting boundaries in their lives.
Thank you, Dr. Baker.
So Dr. Baker provided the perfect segue for this, because we think about, that no feels mean. I'm not a nice person. I'm not doing my job if I say no. But Haley touched on this a little bit when we got started as well. There is so much our no gives us in terms of building better relationships, in terms of freeing up our mental capacity, in terms of freeing up our emotional capacity. When we think about just kind of what we gain with that no. And one of the things that I've kind of that has started striking me the more and more I've been working with folks on setting boundaries is I don't, and some of this is just as a recovering busy person myself, that I don't trust your yes until I have your no. And some of that is knowing for me that for a long time I felt like I had to say yes. I didn't have an option to say no. That no means I have a relationship with you, and there's enough of a relationship there that I can tell you that I trust you to say I don't have the capacity for that right now, or I can't do that, but I know somebody else who can. I think is some of that's also recognizing no doesn't mean not ever. It just means not now or not me. So really recognizing that no can be pretty empowering, and we can actually open up opportunities for other folks by using that no, so that when we do say yes, we are really committing that best yes. And so we think about some of those things and really practically taking these boundaries to what does it actually look like to have this boundary that helps build a relationship. When we think about some of those emotional boundaries, asking in those conversations, will this develop our relationship in a positive way? Or will this develop my relationship with somebody else in a positive way? And if not, how do I maybe step back from that conversation? And how do I reframe or move into that conversation differently so that we can protect that emotional space? With time and energy, being really clear about your availability and then following through. It goes back to that. If you're present, be present. When we think about material and our stuff, being proactive when we lend things. No one knows what they don't know until they know, you know? So when we think about those pieces, the one that came to mind right away is how often do you lend out books to students, to colleagues, whatever. But when we think about those, when does the borrower need to return it by? In what condition? There might be things that we just kind of assume that people know when they borrow our stuff, but they're not us. They might not know. So if we have an expectation in terms of the material things that we lend out to others, what does that actually look like? Another one would be office supplies. Who can borrow or take them? If some of you have, department classrooms, are those whiteboard markers up for grabs? Can somebody move that eraser to another classroom or borrow it for a minute? They probably shouldn't. Another one, just when we're thinking about that physical stuff, that office setup, that hours, that location, what does that say about the space that you're kind of guarding? So when will you be working where? How do you communicate what working time means? How do you communicate what office hours mean? Haley has given the example a couple times as far as that Research Thursday is concerned, but her department head pretends not to know her on Research Thursday. It's just, nope, I don't know who you are. No requests, nothing, not on my radar. And then the last one, thinking about mental, just giving yourself permission to step out of the moment. This is probably the one that I found myself as I reflected on these, recognizing I need to work on the most, it's the easiest one for me to kind of feed into, and recognizing that those mental boundaries really guard our peace. So where do you build things into your day that guard your peace? What are those routines? What are those things that you just kind of hang on to that help you enforce that mental space and have you in the mental capacity you want to be in to enjoy what you're doing? One of the personal examples here, when I was working in the grad office at Oregon State, I had a couple colleagues who would love to come in and chat, and I would get to the office early so I could start working before the chatting started. But they would inevitably come in the door. My desk was right inside the door. So they would come in and they would have something to say. And I finally put a sign up on my desk that was like, you need to stop. If this is an emergency, please interrupt. But keep in mind, your 5-minute story is a 30-minute, this is while I was working on my dissertation, is 30 minutes for me to stop and get out of what I'm working on right now and then get back into it on the other side and get going again. And so once we were able to kind of have that conversation on the other side, then when I wasn't working on that, when that sign was down, we were able, I can be present with you. I can step away from my keyboard. I'm not trying to get out of the headspace I was in, trying to write or trying to process through those things. And so put a lot more peace mentally for both of us as far as how do we really use that to communicate.
I think it's safe to say that relationship wasn't strained at all. I mean, you both still have a great relationship, and it was good for both of you. So it kind of goes back to that feeling of, sometimes you feel bad for putting up boundaries, but they're great. So how do we actually do it? 5 simple steps. Not simple. Simple when you look at them, but much more challenging to implement. I mentioned earlier that this is a small boundary, right? I want to have breaks between meetings. Back in the day, you could walk, you had 10 minutes, you had to walk across campus for a meeting, and that was like, wow, this is nice. And it was a nice little mental break, but I didn't get those last year and a half. And sometimes there would be like 3 back-to-back meetings, and it's just physically and mentally exhausting. And so kind of determining the needs is the first step. I need a mental break, a physical break too, a bio break, they call them these days, between Zoom meetings. That's one of my goals. And so that's a need. Why? What are the emotions that go along with this? Mentally frazzled, physically uncomfortable, especially if they're 2 meetings that require deep thinking. If I'm just attending and I'm more of a participant, it's not as big of a deal. Maybe I can turn my camera off. Maybe I can walk and listen. But if it's 2 that I'm, leading, or I have to be fully engaged, that's a big ask to do back to back to back. So what is the boundary? Okay, I would love to have short breaks between meetings. I'm going to try to have a rule or a policy where I can avoid the back-to-backs and try not to even schedule them on my calendar, especially if they require deep work. So how do I communicate with that? I can have this rule for myself, but it's going to be much more effective if I communicate that with other folks. So one way I can do that is block it in my calendar. We have administrative manager who does a lot of scheduling. I can tell her this new thing I'm trying and she will honor it. If a request is made and I need to be at that meeting at that time, I can tell them maybe I'll be coming off another meeting, so I'll be arriving a few minutes late, or permission to turn my camera off, or things like that. So thinking about how you can communicate that boundary, how you can uphold this new boundary that you want to implement, because it's going to be better for me. I'll be more engaged in meetings that I do attend, and I'll be less annoyed. And I don't want to be annoyed or resentful. But as I start to implement this boundary, there's going to be tweaks that come along. I'll practice it, I'll adjust it, I'll repeat it, I'll figure out ways to make it work for me. So as you think about some of the boundaries that you want to claim or reclaim, just kind of walk through those steps and think about, what is that desired state? How can I achieve that? And how can I communicate that? And I think that's a really big piece, is that communication tool. It's much harder to create a habit if you don't have a community supporting you. With anything, right? With health and exercise and eating, that environment is paramount to your success. Okay, we have another interlude. Dr. Shu-Young Kyu is going to share one of her stories.
Hello, my COVID story basically boiled down to impossible time management. When Iowa State and the daycare my child was going shut down, it's just really hard to fit all the work into a normal day. So work-wise, we have to prioritize teaching, advising. So research is pushed back quite a bit. And also many of our research team members have family members to take care, or have children who don't go to the daycare or school anymore. So that's pretty challenging for continue the research that we were doing. Home life-wise, as many of you know, I have a 4-year-old boy. At the time last year, he was about 2.5 and going into 3-year-old. It's a pretty challenging time for parenting. And he never watched a lot of TV before COVID, but during COVID, he had to watch sometimes more than 8 hours of screen a day. So that's really making me anxious. So another challenging part is that my husband was in Mexico for 3 years. He just came back this April. I feel that my life was much better and brighter than before. So that's another challenging part, that no one else is sharing that kind of responsibility with me. I also went back to see some of the messages I had with my husband. There were some quite intense emotions in there. And I shared with him that the hardest part was that I have to provide that emotion stability in front of Nico, So I have to manage my frustration with very little meltdown or very little expression of my frustration. So I would say that's the hardest part. In terms of boundaries, I don't think I have any. It was hard for me to know that my son is in the room during a meeting or during my class, but I learned that it's okay. My mentor, Dr. Courtney Myers, told me that I need to give myself more grace, and everyone needs to give themselves more grace in this challenging time. It's not fair to compare or to expect you achieve the same level of productivity as before COVID. So just know that we're all having a hard time, and you need to love yourself and give yourself some grace. And that really helped me to go through this challenging time.
So thank you for the heart. Love it. And thanks. It's been really nice for those who have their video on to see some of the nods and see some of the support and encouragement. I think when we talk about these strategies and examples, one of the biggest ones that we talk about is having those folks that you can be accountable to with this work. Because as we asked in the beginning, who does this affect as far as what choices I make? So also having those folks that validate those things and help you know that it's okay. You're allowed to have those boundaries. You're allowed to not feel resentful and guilty and annoyed about your work all the time, or your family. So when we think about some of these strategies, we've shared a few of these in conjunction with just kind of conceptualizing boundaries and where things are, but things like syllabus statements about response time. So when should students expect to hear back from you? You don't have to go to the level of detail where if you email me 5 times in 24 hours, I will assume you have found the answer to your question. Just having some of those broader policies as far as giving yourself some room, but giving those around you some room as well, as far as knowing what to expect. Turning off notifications, closing emails, taking the app off your phone if it's causing problems, going on the writing retreat, sharing your workload. So not just like delegating your workload, letting other people know what you're doing. It doesn't have to be a busy brag, but folks don't know what your capacity is if they don't know what your capacity is. So creating that to stop list. I have a list in my task. I'm a religious tasks user in Outlook. It's ridiculous. But I have one that is my no list. And so every Friday that comes up and I go back through my email and back through my calendar and say, like, what did I say no to this week? Just like I update my CV on my yes list, my CV on Fridays, I go back through and I update my no list as well. Because that also helps you communicate your capacity when you think about some of those workload pieces. Hey, these are the things I've said no to over the last quarter. Are there things on here that you would rather I be doing? And then what are some of those things on my yes list that I need to be dropping as you have some of those expectation conversations with supervisors? Timers, so spending the first 30 minutes of your day reading, or limiting the amount of time on social media, or how much time you're going to spend on email first thing in the morning. Creating policies, and these can be as general as what's in your syllabus to things that you just kind of, as they come up, this is my policy for how I respond. I'm going to ask for time to consider this request. I'm not going to respond immediately and say yes or no. And then thinking about your career as a chapter, Haley talks about that comparison as far as who are those folks that I kind of use as my target, that I want to be. So how do I also pull myself out of that to say, but this is the chapter I'm in right now. That doesn't mean don't write that chapter with intention. So the next one isn't where you want to be, but some of that intention is also recognizing, hey, this maybe isn't something that's part of this chapter as well. And then creating that no committee. We talked about how this is tough accountability work. So who are those people who will help you say no and help you evaluate whether this is something that continues to move you forward, that helps you manage your workload, that helps you manage what you want your work life to look like, what you want your family life to look like. But who are those accountability partners that help you in this tough boundary work?
We're 5 minutes over. So quick next steps, check out the handout, identify some things that you want to work on. It could be as small as creating buffers between meetings. It could be pretty difficult conversations with a supervisor about your workload or your research agenda. Think about some of those things that you maybe want to tackle this year and just try it out without feeling pressure to perfect it right away. Because like Becky mentioned, this is really hard accountability work, it's identity work, it's emotional, it's trying, but very rewarding. So with that, we'll wrap things up. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're happy to take a couple questions or comments if we have time.
Are there any questions folks have for our speakers today? Thank you both so much. That was refreshing and also empowering. I will just be honest with you, to be able to say, hey, here's some ways to help take back control of your life again. So any questions or comments for Becky or for Haley?
I just want to chime in quickly and say you all knocked it out of the park. I knew you would. Thank you so much. I think no matter how many times I hear you all talk about these sorts of things, I get something new out of it, or I feel a bit more empowered to do something about, setting a boundary in one aspect of my life that might improve another. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thanks. Anyone else? All right. Again, thank you both so much. I do have a couple of quick announcements for everybody before we call it an afternoon. First of all, next month, September the 27th, we have Shu Young, who we just saw on video, and Haley Banwart, who's going to speak on the role of feedback on agriculture communication students writing self-efficacy and self-determined motivation. So that's next month's presentation. I do want to mention, in case folks are wondering, we have 106 people on this SACS list. This is made up of faculty and professionals who have an interest in teaching, research, or whatever related to agriculture communications academics programs. So that's a number of people across the country. That's from coast to coast, up and down, every which way in between. So I've been in this for a long time, and I'm really excited about the number of individuals who are teaching or doing research in the area of ag communication. So when you get your email and your meeting request each time, remember that you're one of 106 individuals identified who wanted to be a part of this list to get these emails. So that's really encouraging to me. Equally encouraging are the number of individuals on our mentor and mentee list. And so in the last email I sent to everybody, I asked if you would like to be a mentor or a mentee. And here are some interesting statistics for you. Now, of course, they start the mower outside my window right about now. So as I get ready to leave, we have 23 individuals who have expressed interest to want a mentor, who are within their first 6 years or less. So these are the non-tenured faculty who have said that they would like a mentor. And many of these individuals are in ag communication programs of 1 or 2. And if they're in areas of 2, the other person is probably just as non-tenured as they are, because they've been in within the first 6 years or so. I currently have 3 individuals who are looking for mentors because they're wanting to find someone in the discipline, because even within their own department, they may not have somebody there who's in that discipline with them, they would like to share ideas with. So if you're a tenured faculty member, and even if you have a mentee, I would encourage you to reach out to me, because I received one request even today, so that we can pair some of these very young faculty members in agriculture communications with someone who's been around for a while. So those of you who've already taken on a mentee, I thank you very much. And if you are one of the younger faculty on the call today and have not signed up to participate in the mentor mentee program and would like to do so, please let me know, and I will get with you as soon as I can get some folks to help out in this regard. So again, that's very exciting to me to see the growth and not only the maturity of the programs, but also the growth in the number of new programs across the country as well. I'd hope to be able to provide a time for us to introduce ourselves, but we're about running out of time. So maybe next month we'll get a chance to kind of quickly go around the Zoom call, because there are some faces here that some of us may not know because they're fairly new to many of the programs across the country. Please remember that the recordings for all of our SACS webinars are on the Pi Center website. So as soon as this is posted, I will add this and let you all know that this is archived. So if you'd like to go back through the presentation, and again, thank you, Haley and Becky, so much for being with us this afternoon. I will let you know that as well. With that, are there any last minute announcements from any folks around the Zoom call today? Anything that you would like to share with the group before we go? Okay, if not, I will see everybody hopefully next month, September the 27th. Until then, have a great day. Thanks. Bye.